understanding the basic psychology of the dog you have in your house is quite important.
I always try to keep the content relevant to kind of what I'm dealing with on a day-to-day and what I'm dealing with in terms of what customers and clients they're running into. Big subject we're always dealing with is dog parks and beaches, where to socialize my dog. It seems to be the biggest thing at the moment. I think since COVID and the whole lockdown, a lot of dogs didn't get enough socialization throughout that period, and people dogs seem to be not as social. I think dog bites have increased 20% over the last 12 months. And there's also been, I think, a 20 or 30% increase in dog registration. So there's a lot more dogs out there. Yeah, I mean, I was talking to a client the other day, and they live on the beachfront, and they were saying that they are noticing a dog fight once a week down at the beach, whereas it used to be kind of a rare occurrence. So it's obviously getting worse and worse and worse in terms of dog socialization and these situations. So let me just kind of run you through why we don't recommend dog parks and why we don't recommend beaches as dog trainers. Okay, so the biggest reason is the environment itself is unpredictable. Okay, so you can't predict how a dog is going to behave when it meets another dog in a new and random environment. Okay, so that's the main reason we don't recommend these situations. It's even worse if you have your dog on a leash. And the reason for that, like, it kind of seems counterintuitive, right? Like, we're saying, like, don't go to these, be careful going to these places, or don't go to these places if there's a lot of dogs. And then we say being on a leash is even worse. Okay. And the reason for that is if a dog is on a leash and dogs rush your dog when it's on a leash, it becomes a very, very uncomfortable situation for your dog. So your dog will become more than likely fearful or uncertain of the situation. And the more that happens, the more likely the fight or flight response in your dog is gonna kick in. Okay, and then once that fight or flight response kicks in, that's how your dog becomes reactive. Okay, so then you end up with a dog that reacts when it sees other dogs because it's preempting what is going to happen. And it can be very, very specific situations, like my dog only reacts when a dog is off a leash, or my dog only reacts when a dog is coming directly towards us. And you can get very, very specific problems. So a lot of times people go, oh, it's only certain dogs, it's only small dogs, it's only dogs bigger than my dog, it's male dogs, and you know, the list goes on of it can be very specific triggers. Okay, and a lot of that can depend on the situations the dog has been in previously, and your dog's particular genetics. A whole number of different elements play a part in why your dog would only react towards certain dogs and not other dogs. So these environments are hugely unpredictable because of the variation of dogs in general that are out there, and each individual dog within these environments are really like it. If each individual dog doesn't have the correct structure at home, or doesn't have the correct structure with the owner, and then they take them out, you end up with a whole heap of dogs that don't have the correct hierarchy set up. So they're a lot more likely to misbehave around other dogs. So if you had like 30 dogs at a beach and none of them had the correct hierarchy set up and the correct structure set up in the home, and then you went out and you put all these dogs together in one area, it's very likely that they're going to fight. So that's one of the main reasons we don't recommend dog parks and beaches. Cool, we've got some questions coming. Is there anywhere you would recommend off-leash exercise? Great question. I like the Riverhead Forest. I recommend the Riverhead Forest to a lot of people. I think it really depends on your dog's particular recall. If you have a dog that is quite, relatively sociable or under very, very good control, you have a lot more ability to give the dog a lot more freedom in a lot more different scenarios. So it really depends on your dog's skill level and your control over that particular dog. So the biggest thing is really having a really strong recall on a dog, okay? And that having a good recall can pretty much change your dog's life completely, because it gives you the ability to take it to more and more places without having to worry about something negative happening. So yeah, it really depends on your dog's skill level. I would say areas where there may be some dogs around, but there's not a heap of them. So like trails are good, like where you might see a couple of dogs along the walk, but most people on trails will grab their dog, they'll put it on a leash, and they'll walk past you. They won't just let the dog keep running. And if they've got good control, obviously it's not as big of an issue. However, yeah, it can be dicey out there because a lot of people don't think their dog has a problem, or they don't know how their dog's going to react, and they just roll the dice, which is understandable. I understand that there's a lot to learn with dogs, and it's hard to know how your dog is going to respond sometimes. So yeah, it is tricky to figure out where to exercise your dog off a leash. But I recommend places where there are not too many dogs, and places where people are more controlled. So they're more likely to call their dog back, or they put it on a leash, or people are a lot more polite in those situations. Did you study animal behavior, or what training options are there around Auckland? Yeah, so I mean, in terms of animal behavior, there's not a huge amount out there for studying dogs in general. I've kind of worked with dogs for about 8 years now, so a lot of it is just exposure to dogs in general. So yeah, it's kind of subjective to each person and each person's experience. I tend to find the best way to learn is through life experience and being around dogs. It is probably what's taught me the most. I've had mentors along the way, and I've had exposure to courses and things like that. But I tend to find the best way I've learned has been just by doing it. We currently have a full-time psychologist that works with me, and we're creating a course at the moment that is going in depth into dog behavior and the effects of training on dogs, and putting behavioral science behind the training to really bring some clarity to a lot of training dogs. There's so much out there that there's no real, it's all hocus pocus, I guess. Like someone can say, oh, I believe in this, one person can say, I believe in this, and there's no real backing behind a lot of it. So it's just subjective to the person's experiences, or what they particularly believe. So if like for example, you have the force-free kind of trainers that go completely one end of the spectrum, which it's pretty clear they have some sort of agenda that they're pushing. So, and then you have kind of the cowboys somewhere down the other end of the spectrum that I guess they're not too worried about why the dog does what it does. They're just more of like a yanking crank trainers, I think they call them. That's down the other end of the spectrum. And then you have people somewhere along that spectrum in the middle. So in terms of methods and mythology of training, yeah, there's so many different methods and theories out there with no real kind of clarity. In terms of animal behavior, same thing. It's like, there's people that are, you look online and they're like, oh, dogs aren't pack animals. And, me and the psychologist, Paul, we dive into this all the time. We go, like, okay, so people are saying dogs aren't pack animals, but yet when we take 10 dogs and we put them together, they clearly pack up and they create their own hierarchy. So how does that work? And then we kind of compare it to chickens, right? And we say, okay, chickens have a pecking order, and how do they create that pecking order? The way they create that pecking order is the chicken that can peck the hardest gets first right to resources. And it's the same with dogs, right? So the dog that is at the top of the hierarchy is generally the one that can overpower the other dogs and gets first right to limited resource, which is what you call resource guarding. Okay, so there's so many different theories out there that people have agendas, and then people that have, you've really just got to experience it yourself and learn to understand it through experience is the best way I've found. You can even explain it to somebody, but you won't understand it until you actually physically see it. Dogs work off space. So, I could explain to you that one of the biggest elements of dogs and a hierarchy is the dog understanding what your space represents, right? But when I say that, it's like, what the hell is he talking about? It doesn't make any sense until you've physically seen it or worked with it or tried it yourself and seen the switches in the dog. When you do this, really is what changes your understanding and perspective of dogs and dog training. Yeah, so we were initially, I was kind of talking about the dog parks, and I think it's an important thing to keep pushing, because the amount of people that try socialize their dogs at dog parks and end up creating a bigger problem than they realize. Like, dog socialization is so complex. It's not, I don't say that to scare people from doing it, because dogs do need it, but it needs to be done in somewhat of a controlled manner. Like, you can let dogs go for a free for all, I guess you'd call it, and have a couple of dogs, just pop them in the yard and let them have a run around. And provided that both dogs are stable, it's fine. However, if you've got a dog that's a little bit territorial and you put them in the same yard and it's their particular yard, there's a high chance you're going to run into issues, and that would turn into the other dog, say the dog that came onto the property, becoming quite submissive or a bit uncertain of the situation, or uncertain how to deal with things because the other dog is very territorial. And in saying that, the other hand is you want your dog to be able to deal with situations like that. If a dog is being territorial, they can keep themselves from getting into trouble. So it's really kind of giving your dog a large contrast of communication and contrast of social skills, so that they understand how to deal with any particular situation. That's how I see a dog being more social, as they can deal with more social situations without getting themselves into trouble. Have we got any other questions coming in? Anyone that's just joined? Oh, here we go. Another question. When two dogs meet and the owners pick up the dogs to protect it, is that a bad thing? Yeah. So, I mean, I've heard of some trainers recommending that. I guess like I think Mark Vetti recommends it. I'm not too sure why he would recommend that. I guess he's coming from like an emotional standpoint from the owner, which you have to be careful with dog training. Is it's a very emotional thing, so it's very easy to kind of play on people's heartstrings and grab them into war, what you're trying to throw down. But yes, so I guess when you're picking your dog up, what you're doing is you're putting your dog into a high position, a position of power. And you're not just doing that, you're also potentially reinforcing whatever the behavior the dog was doing prior. So say the dog gets scared and you pick it up. You're somewhat protecting it, but it also it can also create other issues. So there's so much to it to get right for that to work. If you have the right relationship with the dog, you have things set in place so the dog understands the expectations, it understands when you pick it up what that means. You're only using it in certain situations. You're being very careful about how you do it. You're making sure you don't reinforce the dog while he's sitting up there. All these things would massively dictate whether or not that was successful or not. So it's not as simple as just like picking it up to protect it. There's so many other elements to it. We have a fair, aggressive, and territorial dog, especially towards humans walking past our house and car and us. Any suggestions as to where we start with socializing our dog? Cool. So, good question. So, the first thing you need to start with is creating the right environment for the dog to thrive in the home. Okay, so socialization can only be done once the dog is under control. Okay, so you can't, if a dog is, say, acting out aggressively, you can't socialize the dog until you stop those behaviors, because there's something that is reinforcing the dog every time he does that behavior. So for example, say the dog barks behind the fence line and then the people just ignore the dog and keep walking. Them walking away from the fence line may be reinforcing the behavior. Okay, so the only reason the dog is acting aggressive is one, it started from the dog being uncertain, and now the behavior is self-reinforcing that the dog gets a reward out of the people keeping moving or moving past the property. So you've got to break it right down. So you've got to limit where the dog can go in the house. You've got to constantly monitor the dog. You've got to set up a consistent communication system so you can communicate with the dog effectively to stop the behavior in order for the dog to the behavior to start to get better. We should see over time the intensity decrease in the behavior and our control to get stronger and stronger. And then we can actually start to socialize the dog once we have control over the animal. So there's so many elements to get right in order to get to the point where you can actually re-socialize your dog. So first, we've got to get rid of the reactive behavior. And we're going to do that through correct house management. We're going to do that through being very careful about how we communicate with the dog, monitoring when we give the dog affection, creating the correct hierarchy within the house and pecking order, and all these things kind of add up to the bigger picture here. So yeah, so I hope that helps and gives you a bit of clarification, but there's so many elements to get right for a fair, aggressive, territorial dog like that. Any tips for an 8-month-old puppy whose recall is really good off leash without other dogs around and on a long line with other dogs around, but when off leash around other dogs, nothing is high value enough for him to recall off the dog? Yeah, I mean, at 8 months, that's pretty... we're expecting quite a bit out of the pup at 8 months to be able to do that from another dog. You're going about the right way by having the long line on the dog and practicing. But at 8 months, the dog's only really just starting to hit its adolescence, provided it's over kind of 20 kilos. It's only going to be over 20 kilos. It's only really starting to hit its adolescence now. So what happens when the dog hits its adolescence is it starts pushing boundaries a lot. So things that may have previously listened to, like a recall command, may start to get worse and worse if you don't keep it in check, because the dog is now pushing boundaries like a teenage kid. So my biggest recommendation would be you're not in a rush to get the dog off training equipment. You're not in a hurry to get the dog off training equipment. What I would also recommend is practicing recalling the dog when he runs after other dogs. So set yourself up at a distance. So have the dog say over here, wherever he usually wants to play with them, or a scenario where you would usually struggle, and practice recall from him in that situation at a distance. And then slowly work your way closer and closer. You only really want to do 10 to 15 reps at a time of recall, no more. Otherwise, the dog will start to get bored. You want to start to change the rate of reinforcement as the dog gets better. So you would decrease the amount of rewards the dog is getting between reps. So it might be like initially he's on like a high rate of reinforcement, so you're reinforcing him every rep, and then over time you would fade the reinforcement and lower the amount of reinforcement the dog is getting over a period of time to make the dog work harder for it. So you'd put the dog on an unpredictable reward schedule. I would also be careful about how I'm using the long line to make sure he doesn't become super aware of when the long line's on and off. And just things like letting him drag the long line behind him all the time will help. So he's not just like, oh, the long line's on, I know I'm limited. Things like not letting him just run into the end of it and hit the end of the long line. Because what happens when they do that is they become hyper aware of the leash, because it's essentially an unpredictable correction. And then they don't know when the correction's going to happen. So they become hyper aware of the long line. They're like, okay, I'm just not going to run because the long line's there, and last time that happened I got no warning and I just hit the end of it. So you need to be careful with the long lines as well, especially in high distraction areas, and you need to use it like use it in a sense of the dog does it. We don't want the dog to be aware of the long line. We want the dog to think almost like the long line's not there. And that's how you get a very clear transition from having a long line on and a long line off. But at 8 months, you'd be lucky to get the dog off a long line until it's a year and a half, maybe 2. It's why we do a lot of e-collar training, because it gives you the freedom without needing the long line. But then if you go down the e-collar training, there's a whole conditioning phase, takes about 2 to 3 weeks. And all it's doing, I mean, the e-collar is great, but it's essentially replacing the long line. So you need it as long as you would need the long line. And then over time, you can fade the e-collar out of the training as you would with the long line. So yeah, it really, don't expect too much out of an 8-month-old pup. Yeah, it's going to take a little bit of time to get that right. I have a 13-week-old GSD rescue puppy. Things are going pretty well, but biting is still an issue. I've tried a lot of things, redirecting various toys, please. Yeah, so the whole redirecting dogs works to a point. So let me just explain puppy biting. So puppy biting is going to probably happen until the dog is potentially 5 to 6 months, maybe a little bit longer. And then there'll be a little period where he may stop biting. And then when his big teeth start to come through, he'll start biting again. So they generally start wanting to gnaw on things to help their teeth, help their gums and their teeth kind of come through. So being just being aware of the fact that the puppy is going to continue to bite, and you're going to probably deal with this till the dog's maybe, especially for a German Shepherd, maybe 10 months. I would be careful about constantly redirecting the dog, because what I've seen happen previously is the dog, in some scenarios, is the dog bites you to get you to interact with the dog, which can cause a whole heap of issues as well. So you can start with redirecting the dog constantly, redirecting the dog. But if you feel like the dog is starting to do it and kind of become more intense, that's a good sign that the redirecting isn't working, and it's turning into I bite you for you to play with me, which can cause big issues as the dog gets a bit older. So the next step would be for me is I'd be looking at the management of the dog and how I'm managing the dog within the home environment, how much freedom the dog has, how much I'm playing with the dog, how much I'm petting the dog. All these little things play a huge part in how the dog is behaving around you. So let's say every time you see the dog, you play with the dog is going to instinctually want to bite you more, because that's how the dog plays. So you become kind of like a play toy, and your hands become a play toy. Whereas if you have a bit of structure around it, so you bring the dog out. So ideally what you'd do is you'd have a crate, you'd bring the dog from the crate, you'd toilet him, you'd walk him around for a bit, he'd go toilet. You might do a little bit of obedience with the dog, 2-3 minutes, and then you'd play with the dog for a minute, and then you would put the dog away, or you would sit with the dog calmly in the living room and teach the dog to be calm in that environment, then pop the dog away. And you would do multiple sessions like that a day, and they'd be quite short. And every interaction with your pup needs to be relatively controlled, and you need to be monitoring everything that the dog is doing. In between that, you can give the dog free time in the yard for a couple of hours, but same thing, I'd be monitoring how much free time I give the dog, because if you give the dog too much free time, the dog can start to learn unwanted behaviors within that environment. So for example, say you leave the pup out there for 4 hours, he starts to get bored, he starts to dig, chew on the deck, and destroy plants in the yard. That would be lack of management, essentially. So the dog is getting too much free time, so he's learning to be destructive within that time frame. So yeah, raising a pup is there's so many elements. It's not too complex. It's just more getting a routine and a structure right that's working for that individual pup, and then just following that very rigidly and consistently until you start to see results is generally the best way to deal with pups. Hi, Ryan. Do you recommend any particular way of feeding, as that can affect health/behavior, etc.? Yeah, I think the main thing with feeding is making sure the dog is calm prior to getting access to the food. So if you have a dog that gets, quite wound up, so he gets really excited when you start making the food. So he hears like the food bag rustle, he hears the cupboard open, your footsteps go over to that area, and the dog's getting more and more wound up. I would make the dog wait for a long time before he gets access to the food. If it was really bad, I would hand feed the dog. So I would make sure the dog worked for every piece of food. because it can create resource guarding. The energy that the dog has when the food starts to happen is what causes the dog to feel like he needs to control the food bowl. So you need to get the dog to de-escalate prior to giving the dog food. And when you give the dog the food bowl, understanding that that is a very, very strong reinforcer. So if you give the dog the food bowl when he's overexcited, it's going to reinforce that overexcitement around food more and more and more, and it can snowball out of control. So, so I like to make things as simple, as easy as possible for me, but to get the best results possible. So a little trick I do is I make the food bowl and I put it up somewhere and I leave it there for half an hour, and then I feed the dog once he's actually calmed down. Some people may think that's, they're like, oh, that's mean, making the dog wait for that long. But the alternative is the dog ends up with resource guarding issues and acts aggressive around food. So not always going to happen, but it's something you do to prevent it. And it is always good to have control around food, especially when kids are around, or things of that nature. In terms of affecting health, I would steer clear from, like, I don't know if I should. I don't want to name anything. I might get in trouble. I don't know how that works, but there's certain brands I would definitely steer clear from. I would look for things like brands I do like is Arcana. I like. I actually like, what is it called? I feed my dogs this one brand. Some people hate it and they say it's shit, but I think it's great. What is it called? Yeah, it's like Royal Canin, I think, but it's like it's the Energizer one. It's like a Royal Canin Energizer. And I feed them that. I find my dog's coat to get, like, it's good for dogs that struggle to keep weight on. Like my male dogs, some of them struggle to keep weight on. They on Origin, they trim down way too quick and they look really lean. They look good, but I like them to have a little bit more weight on them when they're male dogs like that. The energy levels can get a bit low as well. So yeah, there's like a Royal Canin, I think it's Royal Canin Energizer. Let's just look it up. Royal Canin Energy, here we go. Yeah, Energy 480, this one here. I mean, raw food's all good as well. You have people talk about raw food. I have never really had mixed results. I don't know if I just didn't do it right. I wasn't feeding them a balanced diet, but same thing. I found that it become quite lethargic, and I was feeding them heaps of meat. Like, I was like, this is a lot of food. Like, I haven't had the best experience on it. However, I didn't put too much research into it. I just kind of fed what they recommended over the counter at Pet Essentials, but I didn't see any real benefit from it. And it was just really, really expensive. I see them they definitely end up a lot better health-wise, and a lot better health on that food I've put in the comments, or what is it called? Origin. The thing you've got to take into account as well, the foods that I'm recommending are also very high energy foods. So if you have a dog that has a lot of energy and you're struggling with burning the dog out, I would recommend not to go for foods like this, because the dog's going to get more energy. So it's great for working dogs or dogs that are doing a lot of exercise. But if your dog doesn't do a lot of exercise, I would probably steer clear from that food and Origin, which is the one I feed my dogs. Otherwise, yeah, they end up just with more and more energy, so they need more exercise and more stimulation. So just some things to keep into account. Cool. All right, I'm getting tired now, so I'm going to leave it there. Once again, I'll be back on next Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Every Tuesday at 7 o'clock. We've got a community walk at the end of the month again, which will be, I think, the 30th of April. Hopefully we get a big turnout this time. I think we had like 30 people at the last one. So yeah, good, decent turnout, but it would be nice to have a few more people there. And yeah, cool. All right, well, we'll see you guys next Tuesday. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then.